32 years ago, in a neighborhood that seemed safe in Pennsylvania, a 6-year-old girl suddenly vanished in a moment of oversight, leaving no cry for help or clear traces, plunging her family into panic and despair. Authorities quickly got involved, but the scene had been disturbed. Statements were conflicting, and misguided theories pushed the investigation into a deadlock, causing the case file to gradually fade into oblivion like hundreds of other cold cases. Despite the passage of time, the victim's family never gave up hope, always believing that somewhere out there, the child from back then was still alive in some form. Then, many decades later, from a detail that seemed utterly ordinary in personal records, an unexpected suspicion began to emerge, quietly challenging the entire story that had been accepted as truth for so many years. Before diving deeper into this strange and shocking case, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love true investigation stories, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos. In 1991, Pennsylvania still had the appearance of a peaceful America before concepts like vanishing without a trace or cold case became constant obsessions in the media, especially in small towns where people knew each other across generations, and a sense of safety was almost taken for granted. In Allentown, a working-class city in the eastern part of the state, life moved at a slow pace, children still played outside, neighbors watched over each other, and the idea of a child disappearing from the community was considered unimaginable. The Gomez family lived in an ordinary residential area like any other. The father had a stable manual job, the mother juggled housework and part-time shifts. Life wasn't affluent, but it was fulfilling in their close-knit bond. Amanda Gomez, their youngest daughter, had just turned 6 that year. She was a small-built child with dark hair, moderately active, familiar with her surroundings, and often allowed to play near the house under the supervision of adults in the family. Amanda had a habit of sticking close to her relatives, rarely straying far from sight, and was seen as obedient, easy to manage, with no history of running away or hiding. That afternoon started with nothing unusual. Amanda was in the familiar area where family and neighbors frequently passed through, and supervision responsibility was assigned to a direct relative who still believed that even a momentary lapse couldn't lead to something terrible. The surrounding living environment raised no red flags, no dense forests, no busy highways, no locations considered dangerous for young children, all fostering a subjective sense that Amanda was in a safe space. It was in that context that a detail outside the normal routine began to appear, not clear enough to immediately trigger alarm, but different enough to later become an haunting milestone: the presence of a foreign element, an unfamiliar person or behavior that didn't fit the surroundings. Glimpsed briefly and quickly dismissed, because it wasn't accompanied by any overt threatening action. The initial adult reaction was brief hesitation, a fleeting doubt followed by self-reassurance that it was just a coincidence, that this community was safe, that there was no reason to panic over uncertainties. Any early danger signals, if present, weren't addressed in time, not due to indifference, but because of the deeply ingrained belief that tragedy didn't happen here, didn't happen to families like the Gomez. In the short time that followed, actions unfolded sporadically but decisively. Amanda moved within her familiar range. The supervisor turned away for a moment to do something else, and when attention returned, Amanda was no longer in her spot. At first, this absence wasn't immediately seen as serious, as the common assumption was that the child had just moved elsewhere or was playing hide-and-seek. But as time passed without any sign of her nearby, unease began to spread. The family quickly shifted from calm searching to panic, calling Amanda's name, checking every familiar corner, asking neighbors and those present, hoping it was just a small misunderstanding that would soon resolve. The initial information gathered during this spontaneous search was vague and fragmented, with each person recalling different details, no one able to confirm the exact time or last direction of Amanda's movement, and this very inconsistency heightened the growing fear. As time dragged on longer than expected with no other options, the Gomez family had to face the worst possibility, making the decision they desperately tried to delay: contacting the police to report Amanda missing, marking the moment when a peaceful afternoon in Pennsylvania, in 1991, officially turned into the start of a tragedy whose full consequences no one could yet imagine. Right after the Gomez family reported Amanda's disappearance to the police, the case shifted from the community's spontaneous search to an official process handled by law enforcement agencies, marking the launch of an investigation that from the outset carried significant pressure and the specific limitations of 1991. The local police team quickly approached the area where Amanda was last seen, recorded initial information from the family and those present, and activated the standard child missing protocol of the time, where time was considered critical but still heavily influenced by subjective assumptions about the safe community environment. Investigators were assigned based on shifts in available experience, with no dedicated units for child abductions or cold cases like in later years, leading to the initial scope being limited to the nearby area and the family's familiar relationships. The case file was established with basic data: Amanda's personal information, physical description, daily habits, estimated location and time of disappearance, along with a list of people present or potentially in contact with the victim shortly before she vanished. In that context, assigning investigators wasn't just administrative, but shaped the approach from the start, as some officers focused on the possibility that Amanda had wandered off on her own while playing, while others were more cautious, considering external interference even without clear evidence. The main hypotheses were developed in parallel, but not equally weighted. The wandering or hiding to play scenario was seen as the most common and least serious. The local accident theory was raised but quickly deemed unlikely due to no matching scene evidence, while the lured away or abduction theory existed only tentatively, partly due to no recent local precedents, partly due to no direct witnesses confirming coercive action. This implicit priority on the wandering hypothesis influenced how resources were deployed, with initial focus on sweeping the surrounding area, familiar routes, and places a 6-year-old could reach in a short time. Alongside that, witness prioritization proceeded, centering on Amanda's supervisor at the time, family members, nearby neighbors, and anyone thought to have seen her close to the incident time. The first statements were recorded amid stress and confusion, making the collected information both urgent and lacking absolute accuracy, yet still serving as the foundation for subsequent steps. The scene where Amanda vanished was identified and protected at a basic level, though significantly disturbed by prior spontaneous searches, forcing investigators to work with a no longer pristine space where potential traces might have been trampled, moved, or inadvertently erased. In an era of limited forensic technology, no widespread surveillance cameras, no civilian DNA databases or rapid interagency systems, prioritizing the scene and witnesses became almost the only option for reconstructing events. The initial investigative direction was thus pragmatic, based on what could be done immediately, rather than hard-to-prove possibilities, with the immediate goal of determining if Amanda was still nearby or had left somehow. Investigators noted no clear signs of struggle, no immediate physical evidence of crime, further reinforcing the belief that the case could resolve quickly if focused correctly. However, even in the first hours, some details from witness statements and the surroundings began revealing underlying complexity, though not strong enough to fully shift the direction. Uncertainty about the exact disappearance time, a 6-year-old's possible movement range, and the potential unverified external presence created a gray area in the file from the start. Nonetheless, under pressure to act fast and reassure the family and community, authorities proceeded according to the most reasonable assumptions of the time, hoping clues would soon emerge and lead to Amanda before it was too late, without foreseeing how these initial directions would profoundly impact the entire case progression later. Building on the initial investigative direction already set, authorities focused all attention on the area where Amanda was believed to have vanished, viewing it as the only key point still capable of providing concrete clues amid fragmented and inconsistent witness information. Approaching the scene occurred under less than ideal conditions, as by the time police arrived, the surrounding space had endured hours of impact from the family and neighbors' spontaneous searches, involving constant foot traffic, calling out, opening nearby areas, and instinctively checking familiar spots, rather than following a preservation protocol. Investigators had to assess the scene in its disturbed state, determining what remained reliable and what was permanently lost, thereby deciding the value of remaining details. The core area was cordoned based on the rare consensus from multiple sources: the last place Amanda was seen, a familiar space with no obvious dangers, and relatively within the supervisor's view, but this very familiarity made identifying anomalies harder. Investigators swept the surrounding terrain, noting exit paths, walkways, gaps between living areas, and site-obscuring spots, to determine possible directions a 6-year-old could take in the short time before being noticed missing. However, multiple people entering and exiting greatly limited detecting physical traces like footprints, dropped items, or natural environmental disturbances, forcing evaluation to rely more on reconstructing events through statements and logical inference. From there, a key task was pinpointing Amanda's exact last seen location, not just geographically, but temporally, to minimize the space and time window of the incident. Investigators cross-referenced the supervisors, family members, and surrounding witnesses' statements to find a fragile common point about where Amanda was standing or moving last, while noting differences in recollections of distance, direction, and estimated time. From these discrepancies, they began building a preliminary timeline, breaking the period before and after disappearance into minute markers to recreate the sequence as accurately as possible. This timeline included not only Amanda's actions, but also the supervisors and others, determining who was where when, who turned away, who might have left the area, and who could have appeared in that gap without leaving a strong enough impression to be immediately remembered. Constructing the timeline by minutes clarified a key reality: the disappearance window might be much shorter than the family's initial subjective feeling, but this brevity opened the possibility that it happened very quickly, in a moment no one could react to. While analyzing the timeline, investigators also identified observation blind spots, spaces or angles the supervisor and witnesses couldn't cover simultaneously, enabling Amanda to slip from view unnoticed. These blind spots weren't necessarily fully hidden areas, but could be overlapping distraction moments when adult attention was divided by daily tasks or interactions in the familiar setting. Identifying these helped investigators understand that the disappearance didn't require dramatic or violent action, but could occur silently and normally enough to go unnoticed immediately. However, this normality blurred the line between random and intentional behavior, posing a major challenge in interpreting available data. As the timeline was built to the highest detail possible under constraints, investigators realized some gaps couldn't be filled by statements alone, moments when no one could confirm Amanda's whereabouts or who was near her, and these were the most dangerous voids in the file. Their existence forced authorities to accept that scene reconstruction could only be relative, with future hypotheses based on an incomplete foundation. Still, systematically approaching and assessing the scene, along with efforts to rebuild the minute-by-minute timeline and identify observation blind spots, provided the investigation with an initial reference framework, shifting focus from panicked emotion to logical analysis, while laying groundwork for subsequent decisions in a context where every passing minute reduced the chances of finding Amanda safely. From the preliminary timeline established at the scene, the focus of the investigation naturally shifted to people, specifically, the individuals who were present in or near the area where Amanda disappeared. In a context where physical evidence held almost no value, witness statements became the primary source of data for filling in the remaining gaps in the timeline. The key witness group was identified based on 3 basic criteria: the degree of direct contact with Amanda in the period immediately preceding the disappearance, spatial position relative to the last point where the victim was seen, and the ability to observe continuously or intermittently during the relevant time frame. The person supervising Amanda at that moment was considered the first critical witness, not due to any suspicion of criminal liability, But because this individual held the most important information about the victim's final sequence of actions before vanishing, including location, condition, and interactions occurring in the surrounding environment. In addition, there were other family members present near the activity area, neighbors living within direct line of sight, and several individuals who happened to be in the area during the same time frame, even though they had no prior relationship with the Gomez family. The compilation of statements was conducted in parallel, with the goal of gathering memories as soon as possible while they were still fresh, before they could be influenced by panic, media pressure, or the repetition of questions. However, even in this early stage, the investigators recognized a familiar reality in child disappearance cases. Witness memories are not accurate recordings, but fragments strongly influence personal assumptions and social context. When the statements were compared side by side, the rare points of agreement mostly revolved around general factors such as the estimated time frame, the overall area, and Amanda's sudden absence, while specific details showed significant discrepancies, from direction of movement and distance to the exact moment each person believed they had last seen the victim. These contradictions were not confrontational or indicative of deliberate concealment, but reflected differences in perspective and level of attention among individuals at the time of the incident, making it a major challenge to determine which details were the most reliable. Some witnesses claimed Amanda was still in the area a few minutes after the time others insisted she was no longer visible, creating an expansion of the disappearance time frame and significantly broadening the range of possibilities for what might have occurred. It was precisely during this comparison process that information about the appearance of a stranger began to emerge, not as a clear assertion, but as scattered memory fragments mentioned by a few independent witnesses. This stranger was described vaguely, with generic features insufficient for specific identification, and their presence was not linked to any coercive action or clear interaction with Amanda, causing this information to initially be categorized only as data to note rather than having enough basis to become a central focus of the investigation. Evaluating the stranger information became even more complicated when other witnesses completely failed to register this individual's presence or did not consider it noteworthy in the context of the area's normal activities, where outsiders occasionally appeared without raising suspicion. The investigators had to weigh the risk of overlooking a critical clue against the risk of over-focusing on a detail with no real value, especially since there was no physical evidence or direct testimony showing a clear connection between the stranger and Amanda's disappearance. During this process, contradictions in the statements continued to be clarified, not only in content, but also in how each witness recalled the events, with some individuals displaying high certainty about details that others completely failed to remember or remembered differently, forcing investigators to question the relative reliability of each source. Certain minor details, such as the exact time an individual appeared or left the area, the direction the supervisor was facing in the final minutes, or the standing position of a peripheral witness, were noted, but not pursued thoroughly. Partly due to limited resources, and partly because they did not align with the hypothesis being prioritized at the time. These details were stored in the file as side notes, not prominent enough to trigger a separate investigative branch, but not entirely discarded, existing as unexplained blurry points. The focus on witnesses and the stranger factor during this phase reflected a difficult effort to balance logical analysis and investigative intuition, as the investigators worked with incomplete information under pressure to make quick decisions while still trying not to miss potentially decisive signs. The result of this process was a complex picture in which no single statement was strong enough to stand alone as key evidence, and all information needed to be placed in relation to other facts to uncover its true meaning. Although the role of the stranger factor could not yet be clearly determined, or the contradictions in statements satisfactorily explained, the systematization and comparison of information sources helped clarify the limits of what could be known at that point, while exposing the gaps the investigation would have to confront if it wanted to advance further in shedding light on Amanda Gomez's disappearance. From the contradictory witness accounts and the unfillable gaps that had been systematized, the investigation entered a critical phase, constructing and evaluating hypotheses to explain Amanda's disappearance in a short period of time, without leaving clear traces. The hypotheses were developed in parallel, reflecting the authorities' efforts to cover all possible scenarios based on the available data, including the hypothesis that Amanda wandered off on her own while playing, the hypothesis of a local accident that went unwitnessed, and the hypothesis of external intervention in the form of being led away or abducted. Each hypothesis was examined in relation to the established timeline, witness statements, and the characteristics of the surrounding environment, but not all hypotheses were given equal weight in the allocation of resources and investigative attention. The hypothesis that Amanda wandered off quickly became the primary focus, partly because it fit the familiar daily context and the community's sense of safety, partly because there were no clear physical signs of coercion or conflict at the scene, and partly because the local investigators' practical experience showed that many child disappearances in similar environments often ended with the victim being found near the initial area. Prioritizing this hypothesis led to an investigative approach centered on the possibility of Amanda moving within a range feasible for her age and physical condition, gradually expanding the search radius as time passed, and thoroughly checking locations considered attractive or familiar to a 6-year-old child. Meanwhile, the local accident hypothesis was considered but quickly narrowed down, due to the absence of matching scene evidence, no reports of unusual sounds or environmental disturbances that might suggest an incident outside the line of sight. The hypothesis of being led away or abducted, although present in internal discussions, was not given proportional priority, partly due to the lack of direct witnesses, partly because descriptions of the stranger element were too vague to build a specific investigative direction, and partly because of the general psychology that this area had no recent precedent for similar incidents. The early narrowing of non-prioritized hypotheses did not occur as complete elimination, but through reducing the level of attention and resources allocated to them, causing these directions to gradually be pushed to the margins of the main investigative process. The reasons for choosing the priority investigative direction lay not only in objective data, but were also influenced by subjective and systemic factors, including the pressure to act quickly, the desire to reassure the family and community that the case could be resolved soon, as well as limitations in manpower, technology, and specialized experience in handling child disappearances with potential criminal elements. In the context of 1991, when behavioral analysis models and interconnected databases were very limited, selecting the most reasonable hypothesis based on traditional experience was seen as an effective approach to optimize resources, even though it meant accepting the risk of overlooking less common but more serious possibilities. The direct consequence of this initial decision was that the entire early investigative process was shaped along a specific trajectory, in which new data was primarily interpreted to reinforce the priority hypothesis rather than challenge it, and information inconsistent with that hypothesis was easily dismissed as exceptions or noise. This affected how witness statements were evaluated, how details about the stranger element were recorded, and how the scene was reconstructed in the investigators' imaginations, creating a reinforcing loop of perception that made changing the investigative direction increasingly difficult over time. The hypotheses narrowed early did not disappear from the file, but they existed as secondary branches that received little updating, lacking the necessary investment to develop into independent investigative directions capable of creating breakthroughs. In the long term, the decision to prioritize a single hypothesis from the outset not only affected resource allocation in the early days after Amanda's disappearance, but also shaped how the case was remembered and communicated within the investigating agency, influencing later assessments when the case was not resolved as quickly as expected. Although at the time, these decisions could be seen as reasonable and appropriate to the context, they created irreversible consequences, as each passing hour and day, without results, further reduced the ability to seriously revisit the narrowed hypotheses. Focusing on a single main investigative direction also diminished the motivation to pursue vague, but potentially critical details, since they offered no immediate benefit in proving the prioritized hypothesis. From a process perspective, this phase was not only the time when hypotheses were formed, but also when strategic decisions were made, deciding how the investigation would develop in the future, and inadvertently setting limits that later became very difficult to overcome, as the initial clues gradually cooled, and the case began to slip out of reach of proactive investigative efforts. Stemming directly from the prioritized investigative hypothesis, and the need to act quickly within the time frame, considered critical for the chances of finding a child alive, the investigation entered the phase of mobilizing a large-scale search, where all available resources were assembled with the goal of covering as much space as possible that Amanda might have reached since the moment of disappearance. The search force was mobilized in multiple layers, including local police, county support units, volunteer rescue teams, fire department personnel, and community residents who were familiar with the terrain and willing to participate in systematically sweeping each area under the coordination of authorities. The rapid mobilization of a large number of participants reflected the belief that if Amanda had simply wandered off, expanding the search scale as early as possible would increase the chances of discovery, while also demonstrating the psychological and social pressure that authorities faced amid the growing anxiety of the family and community. To avoid overlapping searches or missing areas, the investigators and campaign commanders divided the search area into smaller zones, based on radius from the last point the victim was seen, terrain features, pedestrian paths, residential areas, open spaces, and locations likely to attract a child's attention. Each zone was assigned to a specific group with clear tasks, defined sweeping times, and reporting methods to ensure that all efforts were documented and compiled systematically. During this process, factors such as visibility, accessibility, and terrain danger were considered to prioritize resource allocation, with easily accessible and high-probability areas searched first, while harder-to-reach or lower-probability areas were planned for phase searching. In parallel with ground forces, available support assets at the time were deployed to expand observation range and improve search efficiency, including scent-tracking trained dogs, vehicles for quick access to farther areas, and communication equipment to maintain coordination among search teams. However, the effectiveness of these support assets was limited by many factors, from weather conditions and the time elapsed since Amanda's disappearance to the initial scene having been disturbed, making scent traces or natural indicators difficult to detect. Nonetheless, the use of search dogs was still regarded as an important tool for determining possible directions of movement, and any reactions from them were carefully recorded as part of the overall search data, even if they did not always lead to clear results. As areas near the initial location were swept without significant findings, the search radius was expanded in successive rings, reflecting the assumption that Amanda might have continued moving or been taken farther than initially estimated. Expanding the radius was not just a spatial decision, but a strategic one, as each expansion meant thinning resources further, increasing coordination complexity, and reducing the thoroughness of sweeping each area. Investigators had to balance searching deeply in a narrow area versus covering more broadly, but with less detail, a difficult choice as time continued to pass, steadily reducing the chances of finding the victim safely. Throughout the campaign, any new information, no matter how small, was considered for adjusting the search scope, including reports from the public, unverified tip calls, and feedback from on-site search teams. However, most of this information was vague or unverifiable, forcing authorities to spend time evaluating and eliminating it, sometimes diverting attention from initial priority areas. Search effectiveness was continuously assessed through compiling team reports, identifying thoroughly swept areas and those still open, and analyzing whether initial assumptions about Amanda's direction of movement remained consistent with reality. Despite increasingly expanded efforts and greater resource mobilization, results fell short of expectations, with no specific discoveries confirming Amanda's location or condition, placing heavy psychological pressure on both the family and search participants. The absence of clear results forced investigators to confront the possibility that the priority hypothesis might not fully reflect reality, but given the heavy resource investment in this search direction, a strategy shift did not occur immediately. Instead, the campaign continued expanding along the established model, in hopes that covering more space would eventually yield remaining clues. Day by day, and wave by wave, the overall effectiveness of the campaign began to be viewed more realistically, not just based on the number of areas swept, but also on the quality of collected information and its alignment with current investigative hypotheses. The failure to find Amanda within the gradually expanding scope gradually highlighted a troubling reality. Either Amanda had not moved in the ways the campaign was assuming, or some other factor had intervened, rendering the entire current search model unable to reach the case's critical point. However, in this phase, the expanded search operation was still seen as a necessary and reasonable choice, both to maximize the golden timeframe in child disappearances and to ensure no potentially relevant area was overlooked without being searched, even as the actual effectiveness of individual efforts became increasingly hard to measure. As the search operation gradually expanded to the practical limits of what was feasible, the first, and also rare discoveries began to emerge, not in the form of a clear clue about Amanda's location or condition, but as items believed to be related to the victim, found within the search area, but insufficient to lead to any specific conclusion. These items, though few in number and not decisive, were immediately placed at the center of attention, because in a context where all search directions yielded no results, any physical sign could become a pivot for redirecting the investigation. The authorities carefully documented the circumstances of discovery, the relative position to the initial disappearance point, the condition of the items, and how long they might have been there, in order to determine whether they were truly connected to the time Amanda vanished, or merely objects that happened to appear in the area. The analysis of the evidentiary value of these traces proceeded with the utmost caution, as the investigators were well aware that a misjudgment could lead to concentrating resources on a direction that did not reflect reality, while overlooking a key detail could mean losing the last opportunity to shed light on the case. However, the limitations in forensics and technology in 1991 made it difficult to fully exploit the value of these items, as advanced DNA analyses or microscopic evidence examinations available in later years were not possible, forcing investigators to rely primarily on logical reasoning and context to assess relevance. Through this review process, the items were determined not to provide enough information to confirm any of the previously proposed hypotheses, as they showed no clear signs of intentional movement, did not suggest a specific direction, and were insufficient to prove or disprove the possibility of external intervention. It was precisely this ambiguity that caused the traces, despite initial expectations of a breakthrough, to gradually lose their central role in the investigation process, becoming pieces that could not be fully integrated into the overall picture. When the initial analyses yielded no clear results, the investigators were forced to confront the reality that there was not enough basis to conclude which investigative direction was accurate, and all existing hypotheses lacked decisive evidence. This led to a phase of re-evaluating everything that had been done, from mobilizing search forces and allocating resources to how clues were prioritized and interpreted, with the central question being whether any detail had been overlooked or undervalued in the early days. However, this re-evaluation occurred in a context where new clues were becoming increasingly scarce, as each passing day without additional discoveries significantly reduced the likelihood of breakthrough information emerging. The tip calls from the public, once seen as a source of hope, gradually became repetitive and lacking specificity, forcing authorities to spend more time filtering, but yielding less practical value. The diminishing of clues not only reflected the objective reality that physical traces and witness memories were eroded over time, but also highlighted the limitations of the investigative and search model being applied, which relied heavily on initial assumptions about how Amanda disappeared. In this phase, active investigation began to stall noticeably, not due to a lack of effort, but because the available tools and approaches no longer made a significant difference. Field searches were gradually scaled back in scope and frequency, witness canvases became more selective, and the focus shifted to maintaining records and noting any new information if it arose, rather than continuing resource-intensive activities with little chance of results. This stalling also reflected a shift in expectations, as the belief that Amanda could be found quickly gave way to a more realistic awareness of the case's complexity and difficulty. For the investigators, this was a psychologically and professionally challenging phase, as it required acknowledging that the massive efforts expended had not achieved the initial goals, while considering how to use limited resources in a context with no clear leads to pursue. The slowdown in active investigation did not occur as a sudden decision, but as the result of a gradual decline in momentum and actionable capacity, as every tested direction led to a dead end or back to unresolved old questions. In the case file, this phase was marked by an increase in summary and evaluative notes rather than specific action reports, indicating that the focus had shifted from seeking immediate answers to preserving information for potential future review. Although not yet officially considered the end of the initial investigation phase, the emergence of final non-decisive traces and the prolonged deadlock placed the case in a suspended state, where no clear next steps existed to move forward, but there was also not enough basis to close it entirely, creating an uneasy void between hope and reality that both Amanda's family and the authorities had to face. From the stalled state of active investigation and the gradual exhaustion of viable leads, Amanda Gomez's disappearance entered a new decisive yet quiet phase, where the official investigative process no longer produced any substantial progress, despite being maintained in name. After multiple internal reviews, the authorities had to face the reality that all investigative directions pursued within the available resources and tools had not led to concrete results, and there was no longer reasonable grounds to continue large-scale searches or in-depth investigations, as in the early phase. The halt in progress did not occur through a publicly announced decision or a clear timeline, but as the outcome of a gradual reduction in intensity and proactivity. As new reports became increasingly sparse, evaluation meetings repeated old conclusions, and no information was strong enough to justify significant resource remobilization. In that context, the case file was moved to storage status, with all documents, statements, search reports, and analyses systematized and preserved according to procedure, ensuring that if new information emerged in the future, the case could be revisited from the beginning. Archiving the file did not mean the case was closed, but it marked a fundamental shift in how the authorities approached it, from active engagement to passive response, where any further efforts depended entirely on new leads arising from external sources. Alongside file archiving, active search operations were officially halted, with no more wide-area sweeps, no more personnel stationed regularly at the scene, and no more public appeals for community involvement, as these efforts had been deemed no longer effective relative to the resources expended. The cessation of active searches also reflected a change in expectations, as the possibility of finding Amanda in the initial area, or under previously assumed conditions, was no longer considered realistic, though this was not stated officially. Investigative responsibility, previously concentrated on a specific team of investigators during the peak phase, began to disperse over time, as personnel were reassigned to other cases, shifts changed, and direct knowledge of the case was gradually replaced by file records. Each time a new investigator accessed the file, the case was viewed through the lens of archived documents rather than field experience, increasing the risk of losing contextual details that only initial participants could fully grasp. This dispersion of responsibility was not due to lack of concern, but an inevitable consequence of how the justice system operates when handling multiple cases with varying priorities, where cases without new leads gradually slide lower on the priority list. Over time, Amanda Gomez's disappearance was mentioned less frequently in operational meetings, becoming a file accessed mainly for periodic reviews or when external information needed cross-checking, rather than an ongoing investigation. For the family, this shift was felt as a prolonged silence, with update calls becoming sparse and communications from authorities increasingly general rather than specific, reflecting the reality of no new developments to share. Within the authorities, the case was classified among unsolved cases, where responsibility was no longer tied to a specific individual or team, but entrusted to the storage system and future information intake processes. The case becoming a cold case was not a single moment, but a process in which each element of the initial investigation gradually froze, each proactive effort was replaced by waiting, and each hypothesis was retained in the file without opportunity for further verification. This transition also reflected the era's limitations, when available investigative tools and methods were insufficient to break the deadlock, and no mechanism existed to reactivate the case without breakthrough new information. As a result, Amanda Gomez's disappearance existed in a prolonged suspended state, unresolved but not entirely forgotten, resting quietly in the file archives as a silent reminder of unanswered questions and unexplored possibilities, awaiting a different condition, context, or tool that might bring new light to a case that seemed to have reached its limits. While the file on Amanda Gomez lay dormant in the storage system as an unsolved case, the victim's own life continued elsewhere, under a different identity, completely detached from the disappearance story, frozen in the memories of her family and the authorities. The 6-year-old child who vanished from Allentown in 1991 did not grow up with any awareness of having had a previous life, but instead began a new journey in an unfamiliar environment, where the name, documents, and surrounding relationships evoked nothing about her true origins. The new identity of the little girl was established as a given in the world she accepted, with no comparisons, no cognitive gaps to prompt questions, because for a child, what was present around her was the only reality. The new living environment had markedly different characteristics from where she was born, from the pace of life and living spaces to social relationships, but for the girl, it was not a change but a starting point. The person or people who assumed the role of raising, guarding, or managing her life became the center of that world, serving as the source of information, behavioral guidance, and social norms, while being the sole bridge to administrative structures like school, healthcare, and the local community. In that relationship, all stories about origins, childhood, or family were received one way, unquestioned, as they came from those she trusted absolutely and depended on completely. The lack of awareness of the past was not the result of active concealment on her part, but a natural consequence of having no clear memories to compare, no images, sounds, or emotions strong enough to recall a different life. Her early years passed in a state of normalcy, where personal development milestones, like learning to speak, attending school, making friends, and forming identity, occurred in ways not significantly different from other children in the same environment. Her daily life was shaped by repetitive habits, family rules, and societal expectations of her surroundings, creating a sense of stability without clear signs of disruption. In the initial growing up process, all interactions with the outside world reinforced the current identity, from being called by name in class and recorded in school files, to participating in community activities as an individual with a clear history and background. Any gaps in her personal story, if they existed, were filled with simple, easily acceptable explanations for a child, not enough to trigger suspicion or prolonged unease. The new environment also provided her with ordinary childhood experiences, small joys, friendships, and familiar conflicts, all contributing to a feeling that life was proceeding on a natural trajectory without anything unusual. The caregiver, for whatever reason, controlled information about the past while managing her interactions with origin-related questions, ensuring these topics did not become focal points in daily life. Over time, the new identity became not just an administrative shell, but an inseparable part of who she was, reinforced by accumulated memories, social relationships, and a sense of belonging to her surroundings. The lack of awareness of the past also meant the absence of pain from loss, or a feeling of deprivation, as what was lost did not exist in consciousness, having no specific form to name or mourn. Daily life thus unfolded in a state that from the outside showed no signs of an unresolved tragedy, simply the story of an individual growing up in her specific circumstances. However, it was precisely this normalcy that was the key factor, widening the gap between the two realities. One, a cold file in storage, and the other, a person living, learning, and forming an identity, without knowing that her existence was tied to an unanswered question elsewhere. Throughout this period, there was no intersection between the two worlds, no direct signal to connect the current identity to the lost one, and everything continued flowing with the inertia of time. The complete separation between the victim's life and the case that had become a cold case created a profound paradox, where the same person was both the center of an unresolved tragedy and an individual living an ordinary life, without carrying the burden of the past. It was in this prolonged silence that the victim's life continued to build day by day, year by year, with accumulating experiences, laying the foundation for a solid identity, so firm that there was no clear reason to doubt it, at least during the phase when everything proceeded in its familiar rhythm, uninterrupted by any unusual external factors. The outward normality of life under the new identity concealed a quietly persisting reality beneath. The victim's childhood was built on a foundation lacking information about her origins, which she herself did not have the means to recognize or question in a systematic way. From the early school years, basic data about personal origins, things often taken for granted by many children, were not fully or consistently present in her case. From place of birth and date of birth to details related to the newborn period, this lack of information was not recognized as a serious issue in the daily context, because for a child, those gaps were usually filled with simple explanations from adults, and the need for independent verification was not strong enough to turn them into ongoing concerns. In administrative and school records, documents related to early childhood either did not exist or were replaced by generic papers lacking the usual details, such as newborn medical records, early life photographs, or continuous notes from a single care facility. The absence of complete childhood documentation did not draw immediate attention, as the system still accepted the existing papers as legally sufficient, and there was no mandatory mechanism to scrutinize further unless clear anomalies appeared. The story of personal origins, when mentioned in social or administrative situations, existed in multiple versions that were not entirely contradictory, but also did not fully align, with details shifting over time or depending on the teller. These small differences were not large enough to raise immediate suspicion, but they created an unstable picture where the pieces did not perfectly fit together if carefully compared. In the immediate family and social environment, these stories were accepted as part of reality without challenge, as no one had the motivation or reason to doubt their authenticity, especially without comparison to any independent source. Small anomalies began to appear sporadically during the growing up process, but they were usually seen as isolated details, not connected into a clear enough pattern to cause concern. These could include the absence of collective memories common in other families, random questions without specific answers, or awkwardness when providing past information in contexts requiring high accuracy. However, in everyday life, these signs were obscured by the continuous pace of living and the individual's adaptation to the surroundings, preventing them from becoming focal points or sources of prolonged stress. The lack of independent verification of personal origins played a key role in maintaining this state, as all information the victim accessed came from a single source, without cross-checking against external databases or individuals who could provide alternative perspectives. The administrative system, operating on existing paperwork, did not probe deeper if minimum requirements were met, and the surrounding social community had no reason to question a widely accepted identity. In that context, the gaps in childhood were not perceived as deficiencies, but as unimportant details that did not directly affect current life or the immediate future. For the victim herself, the lack of clarity about origins did not create a sense of loss or confusion, as she had no other reference point for comparison, and all personal experiences were tied to the current identity as the sole reality. Childhood thus passed in a state that was both normal and lacking depth in personal history, where questions about origins, if they arose, quickly dissolved into the flow of other age-appropriate concerns. This passive acceptance was reinforced by the surrounding environment, where no one actively encouraged digging into the past, and all social interactions revolved around the present rather than what had happened before. Over time, the scattered anomalies continued to exist as unnamed blurry spots, quietly accumulating in the foundation of personal identity without causing clear conflict. The absence of independent verification meant there was no mechanism to check the consistency of the origin story, and thus no reason to trigger a process of self-questioning or personal investigation. In this phase, the victim's childhood was built primarily on current experiences and existing relationships, rather than on a clear, authenticated origin story, creating an identity foundation stable enough to continue life, but fragile enough to become a vulnerability, if one day the gaps were placed under the light of verification. The vague gaps of childhood gradually became more clearly reflected as the victim entered a phase where administrative procedures and personal records grew more complex, forcing the current identity to be cross-checked against multiple systems rather than existing only within family and school as before. Administrative documents, considered the foundation for confirming an individual's legal existence, began to reveal inconsistencies when compared side by side, not at the level of serious errors that would cause system rejection, but in small yet persistent details, such as differences in dates, places of birth, or guardian information across various forms. These discrepancies were often explained by familiar administrative reasons like recording errors, changes in regulations over time, or omissions in storage, and since each individual document still met minimum requirements, they did not trigger clear alerts in the system. Medical records, when reviewed over the years, also showed similar anomalies, with the absence of data related to the newborn period and early years, or sudden interruptions in the record chain, without full explanation. Doctors and medical facilities receiving these records typically focused on current conditions and recent history, with no motivation or authority to deeply query past gaps if they did not directly affect treatment. The lack of continuous data did not create obvious obstacles in daily life, but it formed a disjointed record foundation where key life milestones were not tightly connected by authentic documents. As administrative forms increasingly demanded more detailed information, questions about identity began to appear more frequently, not as direct suspicions, but as technical requirements needing consistent answers. Each time information was provided, the victim had to rely on what had been told or remembered previously, recreating the origin story in the familiar way, even though she herself had no memories or evidence to verify their accuracy. The repetition of this process gradually created a subtle sense of instability, as the answers given did not fully stem from personal experience, but from transmitted fragments, making it harder over time to determine what was true. However, in a context without major contradictions to trigger independent review, the administrative system continued to operate on available data, accepting declarations and documents as they existed. The discrepancies in personal records thus coexisted with everyday life, causing no clear disruption but also lacking complete explanation. For the victim, these anomalies did not immediately lead to an identity crisis, but manifested as fleeting moments of confusion, internal questions without specific answers, quickly pushed aside by other life priorities. The absence of clear resolutions for record discrepancies made them gradually become a familiar part of reality, accepted as unchangeable or not worth deeper exploration. No individual or agency actively connected these anomalies together, as each system saw only a small part of the overall picture and lacked mechanisms for comprehensive comparison. This information fragmentation created an invisible protective layer for the current identity, where questions existed but did not converge enough to form an official suspicion. Over time, the need to continually adjust the origin story to fit each administrative context further blurred the boundary between what was recounted and what actually happened, not only for those around her, but for the victim herself. Mismatched documents, abnormal medical records, and discontinuous data chains combined into an incomplete identity foundation, yet stable enough to exist in the system without challenge. In that state, identity questions continued to appear and disappear with specific situations, not gathered into a central issue needing resolution. The lack of clear resolution did not bring an end or turning point, but prolonged a suspended state, where the current identity was maintained by the inertia of time and system acceptance, while discrepancies quietly accumulated, awaiting a different circumstance, requirement, or motivation strong enough to force serious examination. From a foundation of personal records, with quiet discrepancies never formally challenged, the victim entered adulthood with the current identity as a reality reinforced through years of use and accepted by the surrounding society. The maturation process followed the familiar trajectory of an individual building an independent life, with decisions related to education, work, social relationships, and future direction, all based on the identity established since childhood. In this phase, the identity was no longer just a set of papers or a recounted origin story, but an inseparable part of personal self, tied to accumulated experiences, achievements, and faced failures. Establishing a separate life marked an important transition as the victim gradually moved away from direct oversight of the initial nurturing environment, beginning to take responsibility for choices and consequences while expanding interactions with administrative and social systems at a deeper level. Procedures related to education, employment, housing, and other legal relationships continued to be handled based on the current identity, and since they encountered no significant barriers, they further reinforced the sense that this identity was legitimate, stable, and unquestionable. Separation from the old environment occurred gradually, not as a sudden break, but as a natural maturation process in which those who once played central roles in shaping the origin story became less present in daily life. This separation reduced the frequency of exposure to root information about origins while increasing autonomy in managing and presenting the identity to the outside world. In new environments, where relationships were built on the present rather than the past, the current identity was accepted without deep verification, as it came with valid papers and a personal story consistent enough not to raise suspicion. Maintaining the current identity became part of social survival habits, where questioning origins offered no clear benefit while potentially disrupting the stability the victim had worked hard to build. Each time personal information was provided, the origin story was repeated in the same pattern, not as a conscious act of concealment, but as a reflex formed over time, when recounting the familiar became far easier than acknowledging unresolved gaps. In that context, the lack of origin verification did not stem from active avoidance, but from the absence of strong enough motivation to initiate deep self-questioning, especially when current life did not demand it. New social relationships, from friends and colleagues to intimate ones, were all built on who the victim currently was, not who she had been or might have been in the past, further reducing the need to revisit origins. During maturation, the anomalies once scattered in personal records did not completely disappear but were pushed to secondary status, overshadowed by priorities like career, finances, and personal life. The administrative system, having accepted the current identity for years, continued operating on available data without creating pressure for additional evidence or detailed past explanations. This lack of verification did not create absolute security, but a middle state, where the identity was seen as solid enough for use, but not transparent enough for full understanding. However, in the rhythm of adult life, this middle state rarely became a primary concern, as current challenges demanded more focus and energy. Continuing to live and develop under the current identity was thus not the result of a conscious decision to avoid truth, but a natural consequence of adapting to a system that accepted it as valid. Over time, the distance between the current self and the unknown past grew, not only chronologically, but psychologically, making returning to question origins increasingly difficult, both emotionally and practically. The current identity was maintained not just by papers and societal recognition, but by the entire life structure built around it, from relationships to future plans. In that state, the lack of origin verification was no longer felt as a deficiency, but as a tacitly accepted condition to move forward, when the unverified past posed no clear obstacle to the present. This relative stability meant that identity questions, though existing somewhere in the subconscious, lacked the power to disrupt the ongoing life trajectory, and adulthood continued under a different identity, solid in daily practice, but still based on a foundation the victim herself had never had the opportunity or reason to fully verify. The relative stability of adult life under the current identity began to show cracks when an event that was both administrative and medical, something that seemed like a routine procedure, unexpectedly forced the victim to confront long-existing gaps in her personal records. While completing a request related to long-term health care and family medical history, standard questions about biological origins, hereditary medical conditions, and blood relationships could no longer be answered as clearly as before, because this time the required data went beyond subjective declarations and demanded consistency and logic across multiple sources of information. It was at this intersection of administrative requirements and medical data that the familiar answers, repeated for years, began to reveal their fragility, not because of any clearly incorrect detail, but because they lacked the depth needed to meet the new verification criteria. From there, a personal doubt formed for the first time in a clear way, no longer fleeting concerns or vague feelings, but a specific question about the integrity of the origin story she had accepted as true throughout her life. This doubt did not arise suddenly, but was triggered by the comparison between what was required and what she actually knew, making the gap between the two too obvious to continue ignoring. As the procedures required additional information or clarification and were delayed, the victim was forced to re-examine personal data that had never before been placed under analytical scrutiny, from administrative documents to scattered pieces of information about her background passed down over the years. It was this review process that caused previously isolated anomalies to begin connecting with one another, forming a logical chain of questions that had never before taken shape. The need to verify origins thus ceased to be abstract or mere personal curiosity and became a practical requirement to resolve specific obstacles in her current life, while also addressing an increasingly clear psychological need to understand who she was and where she came from. This shift marked an important change in how the victim viewed her own identity, as the current identity was no longer seen as an obvious reality, but as an assumption that needed verification. In the effort to find answers, she began accessing genealogical sources, initially with the modest goal of supplementing data for her medical records, but gradually expanding to a desire to confirm biological connections with the family lines believed to be related. This search took place in a context where civilian genealogical tools had become more widespread, allowing individuals to access data previously available only through official channels or specialized research. However, even in the early stages, searching traditional genealogical information such as family trees, local records, or family memories yielded no clear results, because the foundational data needed to start the process either did not exist or could not be independently verified. This absence further heightened the level of doubt, as the victim realized that there was not only a lack of information, but also a lack of pathways to access it through conventional methods. In that context, civilian DNA testing gradually emerged as a viable option, not as a sensational or impulsive solution, but as the next logical step in the search for truth, especially when other approaches failed to provide satisfactory answers. The decision to undergo DNA testing was not made easily, as it meant accepting the possibility that the entire origin story, trusted for years, might not reflect biological reality. Before reaching this decision, the victim had to confront a series of considerations, from the psychological impact of discovering unwanted truths to the potential consequences for current relationships and personal sense of stability. However, the need for verification outweighed the vague fear of what might be discovered, as continuing to live in uncertainty became less acceptable than facing the truth, no matter how complicated it might be. The decision to undergo DNA testing was therefore not just a technical act, but a cognitive turning point, where the victim actively sought an objective standard to answer questions that administrative systems and oral stories could not resolve. When this choice was made, it marked the end of a phase of passive acceptance and the beginning of an active process of questioning identity, even though the final outcome remained completely unknown at that point. In this moment, the initial administrative event had fulfilled its role as a catalyst, turning previously overlooked anomalies into a central issue that could no longer be avoided, and placing the victim in the position of a truth seeker about herself. From here, the journey to verify origins was no longer an optional choice, but an inevitable process driven by the logic of unanswered questions, in which DNA testing was seen as the only tool capable of overcoming the limitations of memory, documents, and narratives to provide an answer based on biological data independent of the pre-existing story. From the pivotal decision to seek an objective standard for questions about personal origins, the victim proceeded with DNA testing through a popular civilian genealogy service, choosing a method considered minimally administratively binding, but capable of providing sufficiently deep biological data to compare against millions of other records in the same system. The testing process followed standard procedures, from sample collection and submission to the laboratory to the waiting period for results. But psychologically, it was a time of suspension, as the victim prepared herself for the possibility that what was about to be revealed could confirm or negate the entire identity story she had believed for decades. When the genealogy results were returned, the data did not appear as a direct answer, but as a set of genetic matches arranged by degree of similarity, requiring the user to analyze and interpret them to understand their true meaning. In analyzing the genealogy results, the names and surnames that appeared did not match any information in the current origin story, creating a clear discrepancy between the biological data and the identity long in use. The genetic matches were identified at levels close enough to rule out random coincidence, but not clear enough to immediately establish a direct relationship, such as parents or full siblings, forcing the victim to dig deeper into the family tree structure to find intersection points between branches. It was during this process that an unusual connection began to emerge, not at a specific individual level, but in the convergence of multiple results, pointing to a particular geographic area, completely unfamiliar, compared to what she had been told about her birthplace or upbringing. The data showed that her closest biological relatives were concentrated in a specific region in the eastern United States, and when cross-referenced with accompanying public information, the name Pennsylvania appeared as an undeniable common point. The discovery of this geographic connection was not immediately conclusive, but it was strong enough to completely shake the assumption that the current identity accurately reflected the victim's biological origins. The mismatch between the DNA results and the current identity became increasingly clear as the genealogy data continued to be analyzed in various ways, from comparing distant relatives and family branches to identifying gaps that should have existed if the told origin story were accurate. There were no genetic connections leading back to individuals or areas previously considered her origin, and this absence was as significant as the presence of new connections. In that context, the current identity no longer stood as an obvious reality, but became an administrative and social construct unsupported by biological data, raising the question of how it had been formed and why it existed in a state detached from true genetic origins. Linking the DNA results to Pennsylvania did not happen simply or linearly, but through layering many small pieces of information, each insufficient on its own to conclude anything, but together forming a meaningful pattern. Distant genetic relationships, when mapped on the family tree, showed significant concentration in counties and communities in that state, suggesting that the victim's biological origins likely began there, even though no memories or documents in her current life confirmed it. The appearance of Pennsylvania in the test results was not only geographic but symbolic, representing an alternate reality, a personal history that may have existed parallel but completely separated from the life the victim knew. In continuing the analysis, the victim faced a profound paradox. DNA data, considered objective and uninfluenced by stories or memories, directly contradicted every subjective piece of information she had believed to be true about herself. This contradiction could not be explained by technical errors or simple mistakes, as the results were repeatable and consistent in pointing to genetic connections outside the current identity. This mismatch forced the victim to consider the possibility that the identity used for years might not reflect true blood relationships, opening a new chain of questions about how that identity was established and maintained. At the same time, linking DNA to Pennsylvania created a specific reference axis for the first time in the entire origin search process, turning abstract doubts into a geographically identifiable investigative direction. Although the test results did not provide a complete or direct answer about true identity, they fulfilled their most important role, shattering the assumed stability of the current origin story and providing biological evidence that another history existed, waiting to be discovered. In this state, the victim was no longer standing between two vague possibilities, but facing a new reality where current identity and biological origins did not align, and Pennsylvania emerged as an unavoidable clue. Accepting the DNA results was therefore not just the end of a testing process, but the starting point of a logical chain of consequences, where genealogy data had to be placed in relation to missing persons records, local history, and administrative structures that existed in the past. However, at this point, all that could be affirmed with certainty was that the biological data had created an unhealable crack in the current identity story, and the connection to Pennsylvania, though not yet fully explained, had become a significant milestone, marking the first time the victim held an objective clue strong enough to challenge all previous assumptions about the person she had believed herself to be. From the moment genealogy DNA data revealed a complete discrepancy between the current identity and biological origins, along with an increasingly clear geographic link pointing to Pennsylvania. The search for answers could no longer be confined to the personal sphere, but had to expand to authorities, with access to historical records and data that an individual could not retrieve alone. Providing the DNA results was done cautiously, with full accompanying technical documentation to ensure the biological data was presented accurately and not misinterpreted as subjective speculation or an emotional request. The victim contacted the relevant agency through channels for receiving information related to missing persons and identity verification, clearly stating that the purpose was not to present a preconceived conclusion, but to request assistance in comparing biological data with archived records accessible only to law enforcement. The initial response from the authorities was cautious and procedural, as cases involving identity verification based on civilian DNA testing require strict standards to avoid mistakes or privacy violations of others. After receiving the information, the responsible officers conducted a preliminary assessment of the DNA data's validity, verifying the test source, analysis methods, and reliability of the provided genealogy results. Only when these factors were confirmed as appropriate was the comparison with missing persons records considered for implementation. This comparison did not occur directly or immediately, but through multiple screening layers to narrow the search within thousands of missing persons cases stored across decades, initially focusing on child disappearances in the time period and geographic area suggested by the DNA data. In this process, matching criteria were established systematically, including estimated age, gender, disappearance date, geographic area, and any comparable biological or personal data. The evaluation of potential matches proceeded step by step, with each met criterion, increasing interest in a specific case, while mismatch cases were gradually eliminated to avoid diffusion and error. Genealogy DNA data served as a powerful filter, significantly reducing the number of records to review, but it also imposed high accuracy requirements, as any error in comparison could lead to misattribution of identity or overlooking the best match. As missing persons records were screened by these criteria, focus gradually converged on a small group of cases with many similarities to the provided data, particularly those occurring in Pennsylvania in the early 1990s. Evaluating match potential relied not only on biological data, but also contextual factors, such as disappearance circumstances, initial physical descriptions, and administrative details that may have faded over time, but remained in original records. During this phase, authorities balanced necessary caution with awareness that prolonging verification could cause significant psychological pressure for the individual seeking truth about her identity. When one or more records emerged as potential matches, information was forwarded according to internal procedures to units with deeper expertise in handling unsolved cases. Transferring information to the cold case unit did not mean immediately affirming that a specific case was solved, but recognizing that the new data was strong enough to justify re-examining a long-dormant file. The cold case unit, with access to more detailed documents and experience with similar cases, became the next point in the verification chain, where civilian DNA data was placed in relation to the full original investigation context of the missing persons cases. This handover marked an important shift in the process, as the information no longer existed as a personal query, but was integrated into the official investigative system, subject to legal and professional evaluation and verification. Throughout the contact and handover process, all information was handled with confidentiality and step-by-step verification to ensure any future conclusions were based on clear, indisputable matches between biological data and legal records. For the victim, this phase was profoundly transitional, as the search for personal origins had moved beyond self-questioning to become an official process led by competent authorities. Although no final confirmation had been issued at this point, providing the DNA results, contacting the agency, and witnessing her data being compared with missing persons records, laid the foundation for a systemic turning point where the question of identity was no longer an abstract doubt, but a specific investigative matter, handled with tools and resources only the law enforcement apparatus could fully mobilize. From the moment the information and DNA data were officially transferred, the Pennsylvania Cold Case Unit took over the case as a file requiring comprehensive re-examination, marking the first time in decades that the 1991 disappearance was returned to active investigation status with the involvement of specialized units. The takeover was not a mere formality, but followed a rigorous evaluation process to determine whether the new data carried sufficient weight to justify reopening a long-frozen file, especially since every reactivation decision involves significant allocation of resources and legal accountability. After confirming that the genetic genealogy results met criteria for reliability and relevance, the Cold Case Unit proceeded to reopen the 1991 missing person file, retrieving all original documents, including crime scene reports, witness statements, search records, initial hypothesis analyses, and evaluation notes made during various phases of the prior investigation. Reopening the file was not simply a matter of reviewing old documents, but placing them in an entirely new context, where modern biological data provided an objective reference point that the original investigators lacked. In this process, the assigned investigators systematically compared old and new data, cross-referencing every detail from the 1991 file with the DNA results, genealogical data, and administrative information gathered during the recent identity verification phase. Details previously considered vague or unimportant in the original context were re-examined, particularly information related to the time of disappearance, physical description, statements about strangers, and physical items noted but never satisfactorily explained. This comparison helped reveal potential matches between the old file and new data, while exposing initial assumptions that may have limited investigative approaches in the early stages of the case. The Cold Case Unit did not work in isolation but established close coordination mechanisms among multiple units, including the local police who originally handled the case, county and state agencies, and specialized forensic and data analysis units. This coordination ensured that all information, whether old or new, was shared and evaluated under the same standards, avoiding the data fragmentation that had previously contributed to the case stalling. During coordination, the involved units had to overcome systemic challenges, such as personnel changes over the years, differences in record storage methods, and the inevitable loss of some documents or direct memories from original investigators. To address this, the Cold Case Unit applied file reconstruction methods, data standardization, and modern analytical tools to recreate the investigative timeline as seamlessly as possible. Restoring the investigative process went beyond merely verifying biological identity. It also included re-evaluating the entire chain of events leading to Amanda's disappearance, posing new questions based on current knowledge rather than just trying to fill old gaps. Investigators revisited strategic decisions made in the early stages, analyzing which hypotheses were narrowed too soon and whether they needed re-evaluation in light of the new data. The process also involved reviewing previously interviewed witnesses, determining the feasibility of recontacting surviving individuals, and assessing the value of updating statements in the context of an entirely different reference framework. Reactivating the cold case was therefore not nostalgic or an emotional search for past mistakes, but a structured effort to integrate modern data into a historical file, creating a new investigative foundation capable of advancing further than previously achieved. Internally within the Cold Case Unit, the case was assigned to investigators experienced in handling long-term missing persons and identity verification cases, ensuring the new process avoided the perceptual and methodological limitations that existed in the 1991 context. Restoring the investigative process also shifted the case's perspective, moving the focus from whether the victim was still alive to precisely determining identity, circumstances of disappearance, and intervening factors that prevented resolution for many years. This reactivation holds significant meaning for the entire system, as it demonstrates that cold cases are not concluded stories, but issues temporarily suspended due to era-specific limitations, capable of being revived when suitable tools and data emerge. In that context, comparing old and new data not only serves the specific goal of this case, but also acts as a test of the system's ability to self-correct and learn from the past. When the investigative process was formally restored, the case no longer existed as a passive archived file, but returned to a dynamic state, where every fact could be reinterpreted and every assumption challenged. Although the final outcome remained undetermined at that point, the cold case unit's acceptance, reopening of the 1991 file, comparison of old and new data, inter-unit coordination and restoration of the investigative process created a structural turning point, transforming a once frozen case into one actively in motion again, with the potential for the first time in decades to move closer to a truth previously out of reach for the original investigators. Building on the restored investigative process and old data placed alongside new biological information, the cold case unit shifted focus to fully reconstructing the initial events with a completely different central assumption from 1991, treating abduction no longer as a secondary scenario, but as one requiring serious and systematic analysis. Reanalysis of the original scene was conducted by re-evaluating preserved documents, diagrams, photographs, and scene notes, combined with modern understanding of criminal behavior and child abduction patterns, to identify elements previously seen as normal, but that might now carry different meaning. Investigators focused on characteristics of the space where Amanda disappeared, particularly observational blind spots, quick access routes, and factors allowing brief intervention without drawing attention, thereby assessing the feasibility of an outsider approaching and leaving the area with the victim without immediate detection. On that basis, data collected in the early phase was resequenced chronologically once more, this time unrestricted by the wandering off hypothesis that previously dominated interpretation. The timeline was restructured with special attention to identified gaps never satisfactorily explained, questioning the moments when no witness confirmed Amanda's location and the actions of others in the same time frame. This sequencing allowed investigators to envision the event sequence under different logic, where the victim's rapid disappearance was no longer seen as random, but as evidence of intentional action executed in a short enough window to avoid notice. From the reconstructed timeline, the cold case unit proceeded to build the most plausible abduction scenarios based on available data, not to recreate a complete story, but to identify minimum necessary elements for such an act to occur in the case's specific context. These scenarios considered multiple variables, including the perpetrator's familiarity with the area, ability to approach the victim without clear resistance, and method of leaving the scene without obvious physical traces. Scenario building did not stop at one option, but included multiple variants with differing levels of intervention, allowing investigators to compare and evaluate each scenario's fit with recorded evidence. Concurrently, the roles of individuals involved in the original context were cautiously reassessed, not to arbitrarily assign suspicion, but to determine who could provide critical information, who had position and timing aligning with constructed scenarios, and who might have unintentionally or intentionally created conditions for the incident. This evaluation included individuals previously considered outside suspicion, as new assumptions allowed broader perspectives and re-examination of overlooked or undervalued details. However, the process also involved systematically eliminating unfit scenarios based on unchangeable file facts, avoiding speculation beyond existing evidence. Scenarios requiring prolonged contact, complex movement, or multiple participants lacking supporting signs were deemed less feasible and gradually discarded, narrowing analysis to simpler yet more realistic options. This elimination not only clarified what might have happened, but also illuminated what almost certainly did not, a crucial step in streamlining investigation and focusing resources on highest value directions. During reconstruction, Investigators also cross-referenced scenarios with modern knowledge of child psychology, reactions to unexpected situations, and susceptibility to adult leading, assessing the reasonableness of assumptions given the victim's age of 6. This explained the absence of clear struggle or resistance at the scene, and why the disappearance could occur silently enough to go unnoticed immediately. Reconstructing the abduction sequence was thus not a theoretical exercise, but a process integrating historical data, modern technology, and expertise to create a new interpretive framework for the entire case. When scenarios were compared side by side with confirmed biological data showing the victim's existence under another identity, the assumption of removal from the original environment became more consistent with the overall current information, though specific action details remained unconfirmable. This reconstruction also clarified limitations of the original investigation, not to assign blame but to understand why a viable abduction scenario was not fully pursued in 1991. By placing facts in a new structure, the cold case unit could see connections among seemingly disparate details, from conflicting statements to non-decisive physical items, viewing them as parts of an intentional chain. Though reconstruction did not provide complete answers, it achieved the key goal of establishing an overall scenario fitting current data, eliminating unsustainable assumptions, and creating a logical foundation for continuing investigation in a new direction. In this state, the case was no longer dominated by old hypotheses leading to deadlock, but placed in a more flexible analytical framework, with abduction as the central focus and all facts re-evaluated for fit, opening the possibility of closer understanding of what truly occurred in the brief but decisive period of 1991. From the increasingly consistent reconstructed scenario with biological data and historical timelines, the investigation entered a decisive phase where identity confirmation no longer relied on inference or probability, but rested on legally valid DNA results. Comparative testing followed stricter protocols, extending beyond civil genealogy analysis to independent confirmatory tests conducted by authorities, completely ruling out random coincidence or technical error. Results showed clear matches between the current victim's DNA and biological records tied to the 1991 disappearance, achieving sufficient similarity to qualify as evidence confirming direct blood relation under forensic standards. This match stood not alone but reinforced by multiple layers of comparison, including archived DNA samples, related family data, and other retrievable biological information, forming a consistent and non-contradictory conclusion. On that basis, the victim's biological identity was officially confirmed, marking the first time in over 3 decades that a legal conclusion established the 1991 missing person and the individual living under another identity as the same person. Legal identity confirmation did not occur immediately, but through rigorous procedures, where competent authorities ensured all evidence criteria, privacy rights, and legal responsibilities were met before issuing any official notice. Related administrative documents were reviewed and adjusted, from original birth records and missing person files to the victim's current legal records, to accurately reflect the confirmed identity link. Concurrently, national missing persons databases and related systems were updated, changing the file status from unresolved to identity confirmed, while recording new information for future investigative and statistical use. Database updates carried not only administrative meaning, but marked a fundamental shift in the case's status, as a long-standing major question finally received an answer based on indisputable evidence. Result notification followed priority order, involving units directly responsible for the case, ensuring information was conveyed accurately, completely, and appropriately to each involved party. Notification was not immediate public disclosure, but first conducted internally, and with directly entitled individuals, reflecting necessary caution in handling a case with broad legal and social impact. Completing verification procedures required close coordination among multiple agencies, from law enforcement and forensic units to civil record authorities, ensuring the final conclusion was scientifically correct and legally robust. Throughout this phase, every step was documented and cross-checked to avoid errors, as any mistake could undermine the entire conclusion and lead to serious consequences. Once procedures were complete, the victim's identity no longer existed in ambiguity or parallel realities, but was officially unified within the legal system, creating a clear endpoint for the prolonged verification process. For the investigation, identity confirmation held pivotal meaning, providing a solid foundation to re-evaluate the entire case in light of clarified truth, rather than unproven assumptions or possibilities. This event also changed interpretation of prior facts, as previously vague details could now be placed in a defined context, allowing investigators deeper understanding of the event chain leading to the victim living under another identity for years. However, within the confirmation phase, focus remained on completing necessary procedures to ensure full and accurate recognition of the confirmed identity across all aspects, rather than deeper interpretation of consequences. Completing verification did not close the entire case, but ended its most critical chapter, the question of who the victim was and whether she was still alive. With that question decisively answered, the entire subsequent process could build on a firm foundation, where identity was no longer a debatable variable. In that context, identity confirmation was not merely an investigative outcome but a historical milestone in the case file, marking the transition from searching for existence to confronting the consequences of the illuminated truth. From the moment the identity is officially confirmed in the legal system and national databases, the next phase, a deeply humane process, begins as information is prepared to be shared with the victim's biological family, people who have lived for decades not knowing what truly happened. The notification is not done abruptly or without preparation, but through specialists trained in psychological support and handling sensitive situations to ensure the information is delivered in a way that minimizes the risk of shock or further trauma to those involved. The family is provided with the necessary confirming evidence, including validated DNA results, relevant legal documents, and clear explanations of the verification process, so they can understand and trust the accuracy of the conclusion. Once the family has processed the information and agrees to move forward, the meeting is planned carefully, with involvement from authorities and support teams, to create a safe and controlled environment for the first reunion. The meeting is not designed as a performative event, but as a private space where the parties can approach each other under conditions thoroughly prepared psychologically, with experts present and ready to assist if needed. Within this framework, confirming the blood relationship is no longer a technical procedure, but becomes a reality felt directly through the presence of specific individuals, where scientific conclusions are placed alongside emotional responses that cannot be measured by data. The parties involved are given opportunities to exchange basic information, ask questions, and receive explanations from experts, helping them better understand the meaning of the newly confirmed relationship and the boundaries that need to be respected in this initial phase. Recording the actual impact of the reunion is done concurrently, not to judge personal emotions, but to identify specific support needs arising from a situation unprecedented for the parties. Changes in perception, emotions, and expectations are considered factors that must be monitored carefully, as they directly affect the ability to rebuild the relationship in a context where time has created an irreversible gap. The reunion process, therefore, is not understood as a single moment, but as an ongoing journey, starting with the first meeting and continuing through subsequent contacts, adjusted to a pace suitable for each individual. Completing the reunion, in this framework, is not defined by restoring a family state as it was before the disappearance, but by establishing a new relationship based on the confirmed truth and respect for the separate experiences each side has lived through. Authorities play a supporting and oversight role during this phase, ensuring all interactions occur on a voluntary, transparent basis free from external pressure. As the initial steps of the reunion are completed, a new balance gradually forms, where the biological identity and the identity lived for many years are acknowledged simultaneously rather than excluding each other. The reunion, therefore, is not just a physical meeting, but a mutual recognition in a new reality, where past and present coexist without being able to fully merge. In that context, completing the reunion is seen as fulfilling the necessary conditions for the parties to continue building the relationship in a way that suits them, with needed support but without imposed forms or expectations. This is the point where the identity verification and official investigation process most clearly intersects with personal life, as legal and scientific conclusions transform into specific human interactions, carrying both healing and new challenges. From the official closure of the initial reunion, the post-reunion process begins with practical and legal adjustments, as the confirmed identity must be fully reflected in administrative systems that have recorded the victim under a different name for decades. Updating legal documents is carried out step by step with care, including civil, financial, medical records and documents related to personal rights, to ensure the change does not create legal gaps or administrative conflicts. This process requires coordination among multiple agencies and patients from the victim, as merging two parallel identities cannot be done instantly, but must be handled in parts to avoid errors. Alongside the legal adjustments, the psychological and social consequences of the reunion gradually become evident, as both the victim and the biological family confront the overlap between memories, expectations, and reality. For the victim, realizing they have a different past, a different family, and an interrupted history creates profound changes in self-perception, not as a denial of the lived identity, but as a process of expanding identity to include previously unknown elements. The biological family, meanwhile, must adjust their expectations to the reality that the missing loved one has not returned as the child from years ago, but as an adult with experiences, relationships, and values formed in a completely different context. These adjustments do not occur evenly or linearly, but appear as interwoven phases of adaptation, where feelings of connection, strangeness, hope, and regret can coexist without excluding one another. Stabilizing the new life, therefore, involves not only rearranging material or legal elements, but also establishing appropriate boundaries and pacing for the relationships newly formed after reunion. The victim must balance maintaining the life built over many years with opening space for new connections with the biological family, a process requiring flexibility and understanding from all involved. In this context, support from psychological experts and community resources plays a crucial role in helping individuals process complex emotions and avoid imposing relationship templates unsuitable for the current reality. The media impact of the case also becomes a factor that needs careful management, as the story of a reunion after decades attracts widespread public and media attention. Considering the level of information shared, protecting privacy, and controlling how the story is retold become part of the post-reunion process to prevent those involved from being swept into external expectations or judgments. Media in this case has the potential both to raise social awareness about missing persons cases and the value of DNA technology, and to risk oversimplifying or sensationalizing the complex experiences the parties are facing. Therefore, media interactions are handled selectively, with expert guidance, to ensure the story is reflected in a balanced way that respects the reality of those involved. In the long term, the adaptation process is not seen as a phase with a clear endpoint, but as an ongoing journey, where individuals continually adjust how they understand themselves, their family, and the relationship between past and present. Changes in legal documents and social perception are only the beginning, while truly integrating the new elements into daily life requires time, experience, and gradual acceptance. For the victim, long-term adaptation includes finding ways to incorporate the new truth into their personal narrative without losing the value of lived experiences, a process that may lead to deep self-questioning, but also opens the possibility of a more complete self-understanding. The biological family, meanwhile, must learn to build relationships based on the present rather than trying to recreate a past that cannot return, accepting that new bonds must form under conditions different from what they imagined during years of waiting. The social consequences of the case also extend beyond the personal sphere, raising questions about how legal, investigative and victim support systems operate in long-term missing persons cases, as well as how society views and supports those living with the aftermath of such events. In the post-reunion process, maintaining stability does not mean completely eliminating difficulties or conflicts, but the ability to manage them in a healthy, supported way so they do not disrupt current life. Small steps forward in adjusting documents, building new habits, and establishing balanced relationships gradually create a more stable foundation, even if imperfect. Media impact, when managed properly, can become a supportive factor by fostering understanding and empathy from the community, rather than creating pressure to meet an idealized image of reunion. In the overall picture, post-reunion is not a simple concluding chapter, but a transitional phase where the confirmed truth must be integrated into real life, with all the accompanying complexity and adjustments. Long-term adaptation, therefore, becomes the true measure of success in this process, not in everything becoming perfect, but in the ability of those involved to continue living, growing, and building a future on the foundation of a clarified truth, with necessary support and respect for the different journeys that led them to the present moment. From the post-reunion phase, when the victim's identity has been confirmed and new life is gradually stabilizing, the focus of the case returns to the core unanswered question: who caused the disappearance in 1991, and why no specific criminal responsibility has yet been established. Based on the reconstruction process and data collected after the cold case was reactivated, investigators can identify limited information about potential perpetrators, mainly through analyzing plausible abduction scenarios, indirect connections, and behavioral factors consistent with the context of that time. However, this information only reaches the level of sketches, insufficient to identify a specific individual with the certainty required for prosecution. The current legal status of the case clearly reflects this limitation, with no arrest warrants, no formal charges, and no criminal file opened against a specific suspect, even though the case has been reclassified from unexplained disappearance to abduction with criminal elements. The primary reason for this state lies in the lack of direct prosecutable evidence, as most potential physical evidence has been lost over time. The initial scene was not preserved to modern standards, and witness statements have been eroded by memories no longer accurate after decades. DNA data, while pivotal in confirming the victim's identity, provides no direct clues about the perpetrator, as no biological samples related to the crime were preserved or successfully matched. In this context, any assessment of the perpetrator must rely on logical inference from indirect facts, a method not strong enough to meet criminal procedure proof standards. Another gap in the file is the possibility of accomplices, as reconstructed abduction scenarios suggest some options might require assistance or cover from more than one person, especially if the act involved moving the victim out of the area quickly without detection. However, identifying accomplice roles, if any, becomes even more difficult without an independent chain of evidence confirming multiple involvement, and all assumptions remain at the theoretical level. Investigators also face the question of whether the 1991 act was an isolated event, or part of a series of similar acts never connected, raising the possibility of other victims in the same period or area. Reviews of other child missing persons files in Pennsylvania and neighboring states were conducted to some extent, but yielded no clear enough evidence to establish a unified crime pattern or direct link to Amanda's case. The absence of specific intersections keeps the hypothesis of other victims in the realm of suspicion, neither confirmable nor fully excludable. These gaps not only reflect limitations of the specific case, but also reveal systemic limits in investigating crimes from the distant past, where time has erased traces and weakened the ability to pursue criminal accountability. For investigators, inability to identify and prosecute the perpetrator does not mean the case is considered a complete failure, since the goals of confirming identity and clarifying the victim's fate were achieved, but it leaves an ethical and legal void difficult to fill. The victim's family and the victim herself must face the reality that justice, in the traditional sense of punishing the perpetrator, may never be served, even though the truth about identity has been clarified. This gap also raises broader questions about societal and legal responsibility in handling long-term child abduction cases, where modern technology can illuminate part of the story but cannot fully reverse the consequences of time. In the current legal status, the case is recorded as resolved regarding identity but unresolved regarding criminal aspects, a halfway state accurately reflecting what has and has not been achievable. Hypotheses about the perpetrator, accomplices, and other victims continue to exist in the file as open directions, ready for re-examination if new evidence strong enough to change the situation emerges in the future. However, without additional data, these directions cannot advance further without falling into speculation. The remaining gap is not only the question of who committed the abduction, but also how society confronts cases where justice cannot be fully realized. In that context, Amanda Gomez's case becomes a typical example of the paradox of partially resolved cold cases, where personal truth is illuminated but criminal accountability remains out of reach, leaving a lingering echo not only in the investigative file, but also in community awareness of the limits of law, in the face of time's weight. From the remaining gaps regarding the perpetrator and criminal responsibility, reviewing the entire case process becomes necessary to understand what happened, what was achieved, and which limits could not be overcome, thereby placing Amanda Gomez's case in a fuller and more balanced context. The case began as a typical child disappearance in Pennsylvania in 1991, in a social context and investigative capacity with many limitations, where initial assumptions, time pressure, and lack of technological tools shaped the approach from the very first hours. The initial investigation phase showed significant resource mobilization and good intent, but also revealed systemic weaknesses, from incomplete scene preservation, over-reliance on the lost child hypothesis, to prematurely narrowing alternative investigative directions. When the case reached a deadlock, and gradually became a cold case, the file was archived in a waiting state, reflecting the reality that at that time, the system had done all it could within available tools and knowledge. The case's re-emergence after more than 3 decades did not come from a traditional clue but from the victim's own life under a different identity, showing that the case's progress did not follow a straight line but existed in parallel between the investigative file and real life. Identity verification through DNA completely reversed the case's status, turning a question once considered unanswerable into a conclusion with clear scientific and legal basis. Evaluating investigative work across 2 different eras reveals profound differences in methods and capabilities, not to compare superiority, but to clarify how historical context and technology directly affect access to truth. The 1991 investigation was limited by fragmented data and rudimentary analysis tools, while the reopened investigation relied on big data integration, genealogical analysis, and interagency coordination, allowing the same file to be viewed through a completely different lens. The role of DNA technology emerged as the decisive factor, not only in confirming identity, but also in reactivating the entire investigative process, proving that files thought permanently frozen can still be revived when the right tools appear. DNA, in this case, did not serve as incriminating evidence, but as the key unlocking the door to personal truth, showing that technology's value lies not only in pursuing perpetrators, but also in restoring interrupted identity and history for victims. From a professional perspective, the case offers many important lessons, especially about the necessity of maintaining complete files, long-term evidence preservation, and avoiding prematurely locking investigative thinking into a single hypothesis. Decisions made in the early days, though reasonable in their context, left long-lasting consequences, highlighting the importance of keeping possibilities open and fully recording details that seem unimportant. At the same time, the case underscores the value of reopening cold cases not merely as a symbolic act, but as a grounded investigative strategy, especially when supported by modern technology and methods. Reopening aims not only to correct past shortcomings, but also to integrate new knowledge into old facts, creating access to truth previously non-existent. In this case, the greatest value of reopening the cold case lies not in prosecuting the perpetrator, but in returning the true identity to the victim and closing a long chapter of uncertainty for the family. The case also establishes an important awareness that the concept of resolution in missing persons cases does not always mean completing every aspect, but can carry multiple layers of meaning, from confirming survival, confirming identity, to pursuing criminal accountability. Amanda Gomez being found and her identity confirmed is a profoundly meaningful outcome, but the perpetrator not being prosecuted shows that justice, in many cases, exists in an incomplete form. However, this does not diminish the value of what was achieved but emphasizes the need for a more realistic and humane view of long-term cases. The case shows that every cold case contains multiple layers of story, not only about crime but also about systems, technology and people, where time is both an enemy and a factor that can open unexpected opportunities. In summary, Amanda Gomez's case is clear evidence of DNA technology's ability to change the fate of files thought forgotten, while also serving as a reminder of the undeniable limits of criminal investigation when facing time's erosion. It shows that reopening cold cases is not only about seeking answers for the past, but also how the justice system demonstrates long-term responsibility toward individuals left behind by circumstances and the limitations of an era. In that overall picture, the greatest value of the case lies not in closing every question, but in proving that truth, even if late, can still be found, and that continuing to review, evaluate, and learn from old files is an indispensable part of the journey toward a fairer and more effective investigative system. In today's United States context, Amanda Gomez's story shows that familiar safety can be a dangerous illusion if we rely on it to compensate for lack of vigilance. In 1991 in Allentown, Amanda's family lived in a peaceful community, and that very peace caused the caregiver to let their guard down for just a moment. Combined with everyone searching spontaneously before police arrived, disturbing the scene, the initial investigation had to rely almost entirely on contradictory statements and the most acceptable hypothesis. The practical lesson for modern America is when a child goes missing, prioritize correct procedure as early as possible, call 911 immediately, preserve the area where the child was last seen, designate one person to note timelines and descriptions of strangers' vehicles if any, because the first few minutes determine evidence quality. At the family level, turn blind spot moments into something controllable, agree on clear child care rules, who is the primary watcher, no shared responsibility. Teach children simple American-style safety rules. Don't go with strangers. Find staff parents with young children. If lost, memorize phone numbers. At the personal level, the civil DNA aspect of the story reminds us that managing family records and data matters more than we think. Keep birth certificates, medical records, childhood photos, and if personal records have inconsistencies, like Amanda's lack of continuous data chain, inconsistent origin story, proactively verify early through legal channels. Finally, the story also reminds us of American-style compassion, Reunion is not a simple happy ending. Respect boundaries, prioritize therapy and long-term support, because truth can heal, but it also creates a new life that needs time to stabilize. If you find the journey of rediscovering identity and truth in Amanda Gomez's case meaningful, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue following cold cases illuminated by technology and perseverance. Thank you for listening to the end of the story, and see you in the next video with another case, where the truth is still waiting to be found.